Good afternoon, everybody. I've come over to the Menzel Centennial Provincial Nature Reserve this afternoon for a walk here with the dogs. It's just beautiful weather out right now. It's cloudy, calm, and 9 degrees. And from here on in this week, it's going to get colder and wetter. So thought I'd better make use of this fine weather and get over here. Just going to take a walk back to the lake. This site has a single trail back to a lake known as Mud Lake. This site was established in 1993, and I was fortunate enough to be involved in the process back in my old job. This is a provincial nature reserve class park, which makes it the most stringently protected type of park. Therefore, there will be no major facilities built within it. The prime purpose is to keep it as natural as possible, not to have campgrounds and that type of thing. And the site protects a large wetland complex predominantly. There's some upland sections as well, as we see right here, but predominantly the area is a wetland, formerly known as the West Plain Mud Lake Fen. Back in '93, when I was first involved in this site, this area we're walking through now was open field, if you can believe it. Since then, these red cedars have grown up to become a dense forest over this section of the site. The soil here is very shallow over limestone bedrock in these upland sections. There's even some small alvar habitat in certain areas where you can find some alvar related plant species. My involvement in this site was doing biological inventories of then the 800-acre parcel that was initially obtained or purchased. Since then it's grown to over 1,400 and some acres, I believe, maybe even larger, I'm not sure. So my main job then was to catalog all the different life forms that occur on the site, or as much as you could do. This involved plants, mammals, birds. This just shows a couple pages out of my notebook from back in May of '93, where I'm describing some of the plant species and bird species I'm seeing in different parts of the Menzel Centennial Provincial Nature Reserve, which was then known as West Plain Mud Lake. So after coming in through the red cedar dominated upland portion at the beginning, we've now dropped to a lower level and are proceeding through the first wetland area. And as you can see, it's forested wetland for the most part. Cedars and alders and larches being some of the component trees, ash. One of the prime private donors for the site, Dieter Menzel, was gracious enough to provide the funding for these two boardwalk sections, which are quite extensive, leading into the lake. And when I first started coming to the site, prior to it even being considered for acquisition, this section of the trail often would be going through deep water, sometimes up to a couple feet deep. It was quite a process to get in here. You'd definitely need boots if you didn't want to get wet. You can see here off the side of the boardwalk, it is quite watery now. Here's a nice winterberry shrub with its nice bright red berries. So this being a fen predominantly, it contains water that is more nutrient rich than that you'd find in a typical bog. And so fens can tend to be more biologically diverse than bogs. So in here you'll find a variety of sedges and grasses and orchids and other plants that are more adapted to a nutrient rich situation. You'll also find bog plants too that can survive in either situation, but it's generally more diverse than a standard nutrient poor bog. So through this section of wetland here, the predominant trees that you see right beside the trail are larch and white cedar. Larch, of course, being adapted to very wet environments, and cedar as well. They can certainly take wet environments. And then there'd be a scattering of other trees in here too, as I mentioned, ash and alder for shrubs. Lots of grasses in the understory and sedges. The nice thing about coming in at this time of year is you don't have to deal with any of the bugs. When I was doing the inventory work, I was in here basically from early spring till late summer, and during the earlier mid part of the summer, the bugs are horrendous in here. Mosquitoes and deer flies predominantly. So we've come across the first boardwalk, and now the trail leads into another upland area that once again, in the early days when I was first coming here, led through a field area that was quite nice to go through, and now that's all growing up into the red cedars as well, so you don't get much of a view off the trail anymore like you used to get. The sign here refers to this as the Central Upland, and it was quite an interesting place to look around in those days, in the early 90s, because you could wander through here more easily. That would be quite a bit more difficult. I remember having some discussions with park staff before I retired about the possibility of maybe doing some habitat restoration in these very densely covered areas with the red cedars. I wasn't necessarily saying that was the best thing to do, but I thought it was something that could be considered. Try to bring it back to a field setting, but obviously that would be a lot of work. You'd have to come in here with a fairly large crew of people and equipment, cut the trees down, then you'd have to do something with them, either pile them or chip them or burn them, and that would be a lot of work. So I guess in the end they've just decided to maybe let it run its course, let it be as it is, and eventually the red cedar here may get overtopped with other trees that might shade the red cedars out to some degree and maybe create areas where there's less red cedar under the big shade trees, but that's going to take a long time, so it's not always clear what the best course to take is when you're dealing with trying to restore habitats to what they were. I suspect a lot of these upland habitat areas where the red cedar now dominates were probably covered with a more deciduous forest cover back long ago, but in the early 1900s people came here and lived on the land at the south end and farmed portions of it, and I believe they cleared a lot of that land from the native tree cover, creating those field areas. And then after they left or departed back in the, I think, 50s or 60s or something, I guess the red cedar moved in, and it can spread quite rapidly. Okay, coming up to the second shorter section of boardwalk that is almost at the lake. This one goes through a more open section of fen, which is quite interesting. I remember walking out in the fen here a number of times, just to the west of the boardwalk, where there's a lot of short shrubs such as leatherleaf and small cedars and small larch. Lots of sedges and grasses. And this is what this short shrub section of fen looks like. Some large ant mounds out here beside the trail. I remember seeing those years ago, so they're still active. The common ravens are really active out here today. Must have something they're looking at. Or maybe they're just exploring like we are. And here we are at Mud Lake. Surprised though he wants to go in. So this lake is approximately 60 hectares in size. Quite a large lake, and basically it's a central depression of the whole wetland area that surrounds the lake as well. It's a shallow lake for the most part, I think, but it's got such a peaty bottom, it's hard to determine where the bottom is sometimes. You could put your paddle down through all this very peaty layer at the bottom and it just keeps going. So it's not always easy to determine where the bottom is, but all the drainage from the local area comes into here, and then it drains out the west end in a little creek called Otter Creek, which then flows south to the Napanee River. But very pretty back here. You almost feel like you're way up north in Ontario when you're here alone. You look across and you see the conifer edge to the lake, and it really gives you that feeling of pristine wilderness. I thought I might see some ducks or a loon out here today, but I don't see anything after scanning it with the binoculars. The ravens were making a funny noise I'd never heard before. It sounded like a child laughing almost. Sort of got me creeped out a little bit before I realized what it was. They can make some really strange sounds, those ravens. Aside from their normal cawing type sound, they make clucking sounds and bell tones and everything else. They can really make a lot of sounds. They're almost like a mynah bird in a lot of ways that way. Okay, we've had our little rest, so I think we'll head back now. Got a few other things to do when I'm over in this area, so get back to the car and then go do a few errands and then head home. I'll never forget the struggles I had to get to different parts of this site to do the biological inventories I was carrying out back in the early 90s. I'd basically take compass lines heading off into the forest, something like here. I might have a compass line going off in that direction for half a kilometer, or one over here. I'd just try to get to all the sections I could. And as you can imagine, it was very difficult walking through this forested swamp because there's a lot of pockets of deep water. So you could be going along in shallow water, then you'd hit one of these pockets and you'd go up to your waist. So you'd have to try and route your way around most of those if you could, but you'd inevitably have to go through some things like that, and it was very difficult walking. And then you had the bugs on top of it, but in retrospect, it was a great experience, and I got to see a lot of places that probably no one have ever been to. So that's interesting. I always like exploring like that. Except for the ravens, however, it's very quiet up here today. Very little animal noise at all. You'd swear you were miles into the wilderness somewhere instead of 10 minutes from the Highway 401. So this little sloped area here that we're passing is actually very gravelly in nature. There must have been a moraine deposit here or something. And if you go back into the trees beyond there to the east, you can find a small gravel pit that one of the former owners, I believe, used to extract gravel from to create this roadway at one point or another. I'm not sure when that was built. A few months ago, I made a video where I entered this site from the west and north on a trail I'd never walked before. And it basically goes along the north side of this site, further north of the lake here, and meets up with the small town of West Plain off to the northeast. When I first came here, again back in the early 90s, and this area was mostly field around us, there were a few areas where I could find butterfly weed, which is the bright orange native milkweed that occurs in some of these areas. And it was here up until a few years ago, but I think it's been overtopped now by all this shrub and tree growth, so I don't know if it exists now, but it was always one of the highlights for me when I came into this site, because there aren't too many patches of wild butterfly weed right close to here. They occur mostly to the west on the sand plains around Rice Lake and north of Trenton and Belleville areas. So I'm not sure how this little group got here, but there were several of them, several plants, and they looked beautiful. They were really healthy and big, but I don't think they're here now. I guess I should come back next June and look for them. Some of the interesting plants you may see along the trail here include bog rosemary, dwarf birch, and pitcher plant. These are plants that are specifically adapted to these types of habitats. Okay, just about to exit off this last section of boardwalk, head up into the final upland area, and then we're at the road basically. Here's one of the larger ant hills that I've seen here today. This one's about 5 feet across and 3 feet high. Well, there you have it. A quick little walk into the Menzel Centennial Provincial Nature Reserve, back to Mud Lake. Hope you enjoyed that outing. And I guess the next outings are probably going to be in much colder weather. Sad to say, but we've had a pretty good fall so far. Can't complain.